In the summer of 1838, a 5-year-old boy was carried down a ladder into the earth. He would spend the next 12 hours in total darkness, underground, in a tunnel barely wide enough for his body. His job was to sit in the dark and open a wooden door whenever he heard coal trucks approaching, then close it again after they passed. He would do this alone, in the dark, for 12 hours. And then he would climb back up into the daylight and do it again the next day. His name was never recorded. We know about him only because a parliamentary inspector stumbled across him during an investigation and wrote down what he found. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel tells the buried stories of the Victorian era, the ones that didn't make it into the history books. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this video earns it, a like helps more than you know. Now, back to 1838, and the children the Industrial Revolution preferred not to think about. The use of children in British industry was not an invention of the Victorian era. Children had worked alongside adults in agriculture, in domestic manufacturing, in small trades, for as long as anyone could remember. What the Industrial Revolution changed was not the fact of child labor, but its scale, its intensity, and its visibility. The factories and mines that drove Britain's economic transformation in the 19th century needed workers in quantities and configurations that adult bodies could not always supply. The early textile mills, with their low-ceilinged rooms and narrow machinery gaps, benefited from small fingers and small bodies. The coal mines, with their tight seams and their need for trappers, children who operated ventilation doors in the narrowest passages, required workers small enough to fit in spaces where adults could not go. And children were cheap. Cheaper than adults, cheaper than any alternative. In an economy with no minimum wage, no labor regulations, and no compulsory schooling, the employment of a 6-year-old child at a fraction of an adult wage was not just permitted, it was standard practice. The conditions in which these children worked were, by any modern standard, catastrophic.
In the textile mills, children as young as 5 or 6 were employed as scavengers, crawling under the moving machinery to collect loose cotton fibers while the machines were running. The machines were not stopped. The child crawled beneath moving parts that could catch hair, clothing, or fingers with no warning and no mercy. Injuries were common. Deaths were not unusual. They were absorbed into the general statistical noise of industrial accident and recorded, if at all, as regrettable misfortunes. Piecers, slightly older children who joined broken threads on the spinning machines, worked standing at the machinery for shifts of 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours. The work required constant, precise manual attention and punished any lapse with damaged threads, damaged machines, and beatings from overlookers who were responsible for production output and had no particular reason to care about the physical state of their workforce. The overlooker's strap was a constant presence in the early Victorian mill. Children who fell asleep, and they did fall asleep, at their machines, standing up after 12 hours of physical labor, were woken with it. Children who made errors were beaten with it. The line between discipline and cruelty was not one that the mill system drew with any consistency. In the coal mines, the situation was in some ways worse and in some ways different. The mines required a hierarchy of child workers that descended in
age and in the horror of the work. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the trappers, children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, whose sole job was to sit in darkness beside a ventilation door and open it on signal. The ventilation doors were essential. They controlled the flow of air through the mine and prevented the accumulation of explosive gases. Someone had to operate them. The someone the mining industry chose was its youngest available workers. A trapper's day was spent in total or near total darkness. Candles were expensive, and many trappers worked without any light at all, in a passage barely large enough to sit in, for shifts of 12 hours or more. They were alone. There was no conversation, no movement, no stimulation of any kind. Just the darkness, the sound of distant machinery, and the occasional vibration of approaching coal trucks that signaled the need to pull the door open.
The psychological effect on very young children of spending their formative years in this environment is not something the Victorian mine owners thought about. The parliamentary commissioners who investigated the mines in 1842 thought about it considerably. Their report and the illustrations that accompanied it were among the most powerful pieces of social documentation produced in the Victorian era. The Mines Act of 1842 was the direct result of this investigation. It prohibited the employment of women and girls underground and set a minimum age of 10 for boys working in mines. It was a significant reform, and it was bitterly opposed by the mining industry, which argued that boy trappers younger than 10 were essential to safe mine operation and that removing them would cause accidents. This argument, that the safety of the mine required the exploitation of its youngest workers, was made with a straight face in parliamentary testimony by mine owners whose concern for mine safety had never previously extended to the children working in it. The Factory Act of 1833 had already made a beginning in the textile industry. It prohibited the employment of children under 9 in textile mills, limited children aged 9 to 13 to 9 hours of work per day, and, crucially, required 2 hours of daily education for child workers. It also created the first factory inspectorate, paid government officials whose job was to enforce the legislation. The creation of the factory inspectorate mattered enormously because one of the persistent features of early Victorian child labor reform was the gap between what the law said and what actually happened in practice. Factory owners routinely falsified the ages of their child workers, claimed that children were attending school when they were not, and obstructed inspectors in a dozen ways that the early legislation had not anticipated. The inspectors documented all of this. Their reports, meticulous, specific, and often furious, are among the most valuable primary sources we have for understanding what early Victorian industrial childhood actually looked like. The reformers who drove the legislation forward were a diverse coalition. Robert Owen, the industrialist turned social reformer, had demonstrated in his own mills at New Lanark that restricting child labor and providing education produced workers who were healthier, more productive, and less likely to die before they were useful. His argument was partly humanitarian and partly economic, and the economic argument was the one that gained traction with a parliament composed largely of industrialists and landowners. Richard Osler, a land agent from Yorkshire, began a public campaign in 1830 with a letter to the Leeds Mercury that compared the treatment of factory children directly and explicitly with the treatment of enslaved people in Britain's colonies. The comparison was deliberate and inflammatory. Britain had abolished the slave trade in 1807 and was in the process of abolishing slavery itself in its colonies. Osler's point, that the children in its own factories were being treated with less concern than the enslaved people it was congratulating itself for liberating, was uncomfortable and difficult to dismiss. Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, became the parliamentary champion of factory reform in the 1840s. His career as a reformer spanned 4 decades and encompassed not just factory legislation, but the reform of lunatic asylums, the regulation of chimney sweeps, and the improvement of working-class housing. He was a conservative, an Anglican, and a man who held many of the social views of his class, but on the specific question of child labor, he was relentless. The chimney sweeps deserve
own chapter.
Because their story is one of the most specific and most documented examples of Victorian child labor, and one of the most prolonged legislative failures in British reform history. Climbing boys, children employed to climb inside chimney flues and clean them from the inside, were in use from at least the 17th century. The technology of the period offered no reliable alternative. Chimneys were not built with cleaning access in mind, and the accumulation of soot in residential and industrial flues was a genuine fire hazard that required regular removal. What it required was a child small enough to fit inside the flue, physically strong enough to climb while scraping soot from the walls, and sufficiently conditioned to the experience not to panic in the confined darkness. The children who performed this work were typically aged between 4 and 10. They were recruited from workhouses, from destitute families, from parents who sold them into service in exchange for a premium. They lived with their master sweep, performing domestic labor when not climbing, sleeping in cellars or under stairs, and breathing soot-laden air for essentially their entire waking lives. The occupational diseases of the climbing boy were specific and well documented. Soot warts, chimney sweeps cancer, was the first occupational cancer ever described in medical literature, identified by Surgeon Percival Pott in 1775. It was caused by the chronic exposure of the scrotal skin to coal soot and was essentially untreatable. It was endemic among adult chimney sweeps who had spent their childhoods climbing. Legislation to regulate the use of climbing boys began as early as 1788. It continued in various forms for nearly a century, consistently failing to achieve enforcement because the alternative to child labor, mechanical chimney sweeping brushes, was resisted by the master sweeps on commercial grounds, and because the fines for using climbing boys were low enough to be absorbed as a cost of business. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 finally provided for effective enforcement, making it a licensing requirement for master sweeps, enforceable by police, with meaningful penalties for violation. By this point, children had been climbing chimneys in Britain for at least 200 years. The story of Victorian child labor reform is not a story of rapid progress or easy victories. It is a story of incremental, contested, frequently reversed reform, in which the interests of children competed against the financial interests of industrialists who employed them, and in which the outcome of each legislative battle was determined as much by political calculation as by humanitarian conviction. But it is also a story of ordinary people who refused to accept what they were told was inevitable. Robert Osler, Lord Shaftesbury, the factory inspectors who wrote their meticulous, infuriated reports, the journalists and novelists, Dickens above all, who transformed the dry language of parliamentary reports into stories that middle-class readers could feel. The 5-year-old boy in the dark passage with his ventilation door never knew their names. He probably never learned to read. His name was never recorded, and his story reaches us only as a single sentence in a parliamentary report from 1838. But the people who read that report and were disturbed by it eventually changed the law that put him there. If the hidden histories of childhood and labor matter to you, subscribe. Every week, we find the stories that were almost lost. Next week, the Victorian prison system, and what happened when reformers decided that suffering was the cure for crime. See you then.